Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another fresh day of grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And today we're on a book club episode with Gregory Goswell, and he wrote a book published by Lexham Academic. Here it is here. Text and Paratext, book, order, title, and division as keys to biblical interpretation. And a little tradition I've been doing is I read one endorsement from a guest that we've had on our show before, and so far we're batting 1,000. There's always a guest that we've had on, and that wrote an endorsement. So Darian Lockett said this about Goswell's book. Goswell's work offers expert guidance for and generous invitation to appreciating the hermeneutical difference canon makes in hearing the Bible as the church's book. So if you guys go to our show notes, there is a link to Lexham Academic. Click that link, get Text and Paratext book here, and then also just information about Greg Goswell, and also finding a local church finder. If you need help finding a church, if you're not part of a church, there is a link to find a confessional or a Reformed church near you to help you out. And just other information about how to find myself, Nick, or Peter. Easiest way is email or Twitter or Instagram or YouTube. These videos, these conversations are put up on the YouTube verse out there. And so if that's more of an easier platform for you guys, then we have you there. We'll about halfway through the show, you'll hear some words from our sponsors, some other bridge builders. So Logos Bible Software, our main sponsor, and then some words from some of our other very important sponsors. So I'll let Peter further introduce Greg Goswell today.
Yeah, we have Dr. Gregory Goswell, who's academic dean and lecturer in Old Testament at Christ College in Sydney, Australia. He is co-author with Andrew Abernethy of God's Messiah in the Old Testament, which is fantastic, Expectations of a King Across the Old Testament, and author of numerous academic articles on text and paratext, which we'll talk about in today's episode. So thanks for coming on, Dr. Goswell. Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. Yeah, and it was kind of funny that Nick put up that endorsement because Lockett, by the time this episode's come out, it'll be official. Lockett is an elder at the church that we've been attending, which is really cool in Orange. Mm-hmm. He's a PCA elder, so it's cool to see kind of worlds colliding in this. So we'll start off with the first question, Dr. Goswell. Let our listeners know a little about yourself, your background.
Well, you've told them most things they need to know, and I think you know more about me than I do. But I need to say that I was a pastor and missionary for 20 years before I got into academia. I've been lecturing full-time for the last 21 years, so I kind of should know what I'm talking about. But I'll let the listeners be the judge. I'm married to Mignon. We have 4 adult children, 3 grandchildren. I'm an ordained Presbyterian minister down here in Australia. They're kind of the basic things. Yeah.
Amen. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, this would be cool to talk about some of these things. Yeah, this is cool.
Let's jump right in. So the title of the book for the audience, once again, is Text and Paratext. You guys on YouTube can see the title of the book in the cover. So some of our lay audience might want a reminder or refresher or just articulate the definition of paratext. So if part of this question be if you can help define that. But going into the canonical order and paratextual features sound like they're regulated to academic circles. So that's why I also ask kind of a definition of paratext, because we can see how it's not just regulated to academic circles. And some lay people might think, well, this seems kind of high in the clouds, a little too high for us, getting lost in the weeds. Like, why is it important? But however, you spend an entirety of your book dispelling this gut reaction. So it's a very helpful, edifying us in that way. What are some paratextual features and how do they play out in our everyday reading of the Bible?
Well, thankfully, paratext is a fancy term for something really simple. The Bible as a work of literature is made up of text and paratext. And so basically, paratext is everything in the Bible apart from the text itself, if we think of text strictly being the words. Sometimes people ask me, what am I studying? And I cheekily reply that I'm an expert in the Bible, everything apart from the words. And when they kind of blankly look back at me, I then go on to explain. The paratext has got three main parts. We're thinking of the titles of the book, the orders of the book, and how the text itself is broken up into paragraphs and things like this. And sometimes we don't notice things even when they're staring us in the face until they're pointed out. And paratext is one of those things. We've got our Bible, and many Bible readers, they may not have noticed the way in which the Bible is packaged and framed by these things, the order of the books, their names, how the text is broken up. And so this is what this book by Lexham is about, to draw attention to the paratext, because it does influence how we read the Bible. For example, the chapter divisions we're familiar with, we're influenced by these things. Now, often we only refer to the chapter divisions, like the minister in a sermon may. We only talk about them to criticise them. We think they're in the wrong spot or something like that. But the paratext deserves more deliberate and careful treatment than just that.
Yeah, that's how. Just the reason why I'm laughing is that's exactly what I did yesterday. Was during the sermon I preached on John 10. I talked about the unfortunate chapter break between chapter 9 and chapter 10,
Absolutely.
between the healing of the blind man and
the one follows the other. The one
shepherd.
builds on the other,
and then exactly, yeah, because John 10:21 is John linking that parable with the blind man. I was like, this would be so great if we could just read these together.
Let's just agree that sometimes we're going to refer to the chapter divisions when we think it's in the right spot. Yeah.
That's true. No, I agree with that. That's a helpful reminder, especially for me. And for this too, for yourself, you've done a ton of work on the Old Testament in particular. And I think especially so focusing on the prophets, as well as what we talked about before recording. You just co-authored a book with Andreas Kostenberger, who we've had on the show before, on a biblical theology book for Crossway. And so maybe if you can tie in your work on the prophets, maybe a little bit of biblical theology, how are these paratextual features, either, we just talked about this, hindering or aiding in our reading of the Bible as a holistic text?
Well, just before I get into trouble by suggesting that sometimes these features hinder our Bible interpretation, I need to hasten to just emphasise that the paratextual features like book titles, the way the books are organised, these are not due to the inspired authors, but these are things that early readers of the Bible have produced for us. And so this gives us the freedom. It allows us to either accept or resist the prompts given by the paratext. Now, can I give you an example of where a chapter division, maybe does hinder reading? You gave one in John 10.
Sure.
Another example would be Esther chapter 10, which just consists of the three final verses in the book, but succeeds in excluding any mention of the heroine Esther in this last section. Even though it's through her bold action and quick thinking that, these are the things which enable the preservation of the Jewish race in this crisis. Was it that some readers were uncomfortable in the prominence given to this remarkable woman, and so they've managed to kind of edit her out, so to speak, in the final chapter of Esther? An example of aiding our reading, the title of the Acts of the Apostles. It draws attention to the fact that Acts is not just about Paul, but a number of the apostles are featured, particularly John and Peter in the first half of the book. And that suggests that, yes, the different apostles in Acts are not rivals, but they're proclaiming the one gospel. And so the title we're familiar with is very helpful because it helps us to see that the unity of the apostolic witness to Jesus is an important part of the message of that book. So they're an example of hindering, an example of helping.
Awesome. That's great.
Yeah, and before we get much deeper into the conversation, this book helped kind of cover some things that I've always wondered as a layperson that's interested in theology and understanding the Bible better and have a lot of questions that I've pondered, many times, that verses that there's a lot of, as we know, the Bible is broken up in verses. There's books, 66 books. They're broken up in chapters and verses. And those chapters and verses, there's numerical values, where they start and stop, weren't actually penned by the actual author. It was, like Paul, when he wrote Romans, he wrote Romans. He wasn't writing Romans, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 8 and 16. He didn't have individual verses put in. And so it made me think too, is like there's a very big importance in context. So when you, like, just talking about Romans, read Romans 1 to 16 versus just cherry picking verses. And so I think Paul, as the writer, respecting the author, they had that in mind where they're writing the entire book. They weren't writing little pieces here and there for people to cherry pick and make their own context. So the books have the entirety, have the context, and then also those books within the Bible have a context within
exactly.
the other
That's what I'm trying to suggest. And as far as we know, all ancient manuscripts had breaks and divisions in the text, paragraphs. Mm-hmm. And Codex Vaticanus is the earliest example of the division of the Bible into chapters or chapter-like divisions. So we've always divided up the texts. We're not at all certain how the original writers broke up the text, because it does appear that the breaks we have been provided by later readers and scribes. So again, they can be studied, we can consider them. We've got the freedom to either agree or disagree with the way in which they're suggesting, the texts are best divided.
Yeah, thank you. So going into part one of your book, which is canonical structure, starting with the order of the books in the Bible. At first glance, many think there isn't just an order that we have in our English Bibles or within other textual traditions. There's other orders that people may or may not be aware of. The Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, they have different orders of the Bible, find completely different ordering. So we could get confused. Well, who's wrong? Who's right? Is everyone right? Is everyone wrong? How did they get to those orders? Are some of the examples different ordering of the book of the Bible? And how do they actually showcase the editor's presumption of the way it ought to be?
Well, there are different orders, but and the book order in the Old Testament, for example, is very much influenced by the Greek Old Testament canonical tradition. But let's agree not to be confused, because there is actually a lot of common overlap between the orders. So the orders aren't completely different. Every Old Testament is going to have the Pentateuch as at the start, the origin of the world, the origin of Israel, setting a foundation that all that follows. Most New Testament canon lists and Bibles are going to have the four Gospels at the beginning to indicate the importance of the ministry, death and resurrection of Jesus for everything that follows. So there are differences, but they're not to be overemphasized. It's actually a tremendous advantage that we have different canonical orders, because this provides different ways or different viewpoints by which we can look at books. Let me give you the example of Ruth, because it's a very nice one. Ruth is placed after Judges in the Greek tradition. That's the position we're used to. It's put after Proverbs 31 in the Hebrew Masoretic tradition, and it's in front of the book of Psalms in the Talmud, where there's also a list of Bible books. And these different positions suggest alternate ways of viewing the book of Ruth, and each in its own way is helpful. So Ruth, between Judges and Samuel, it's the prehistory of the family of David, and that gives a messianic focus to our reading of the book. When we find Ruth after Proverbs 31, then Ruth becomes a real-life example of this ideal woman of Proverbs who embodies wisdom, and so that suggests an ethical reading of the book. The heroine Ruth, who is a model of wise and godly behaviour in a family crisis. Ruth in front of Proverbs Ruth anticipates the kind of devotion to God that we see David expressing in the Psalms. And so just as David took refuge in God in all his troubles, Ruth also is described as someone who has come under God's wings to take refuge. And so each of those canonical positions provide very helpful insight and commentary on Ruth. An example from the New Testament would be the way in which Acts is followed by the Catholic epistles, the 7 letters starting with James. And in fact, in every ancient Greek manuscript, Acts is always followed by the Catholic epistles. And so that alerts us, again, yes, the first half of the book of Acts is about apostles and evangelists other than Paul. And in our Bible, of course, Acts is followed by Romans and the other letters of Paul. That also is very appropriate because at the end of Romans, chapter 28, Paul's in Rome, and then the next letter is Paul's letter to Rome, in which he actually anticipates this visit to Rome, which is described in chapter 28. So there can be alternate placements of particular Bible books, but often those placements are deliberate and contain an insight, something which is helpful for our exegesis, our interpretation of the Bible. So I view these alternatives as providing commentary on the Bible text. And like all commentary, you've got to think about it, you've got to consider it, but it is helpful when it feeds into our own reading of the Bible.
Yeah, we can start to see how that's really helping our hermeneutical approach, knowing that wise kind of teaching that you're saying. Going into more of the historical background of book titles. So this is more covered in your part 2 of your book titles. So can you give us some historical background concerning book titles? And I know you mentioned something that I've thought about before too, with First and Second Kings could just as easily be called First and Second Prophets. So why is it called, there's other examples you write about, but that's the one I've thought about, like, why is it called Kings and not Prophets?
Yeah, we don't know the full history of, when the titles were first assigned to the Bible books. Remember how Jesus refers to the book of Exodus, but he doesn't call it Exodus. He says the passage about the bush. So he doesn't have the titles and the chapters and so forth in the way in which we do. But the book of Psalms is called Psalms, for example, in Luke 24. So in the time of Jesus, a number of the books have titles that can be used. A number of the Old Testament books have more than one title. Let me give you the example. The book of Numbers, as we call it, that comes from the Greek tradition. But in the Hebrew Bible, it's named after the first few words, in the wilderness. Now, both those titles contain an exegetical insight, I would suggest. When we call it Numbers, it is alerting us to the census list in Numbers chapters 1 and 26, and those chapters are probably the best indicator of how we can break the book into its 2 halves. In the wilderness, the Hebrew title, that's alerting us to what really makes Numbers different from the book before it and after it, namely its focus on what happened during the years of wandering in the desert. So both those titles are giving us information about the book, but of course, no title can say everything about a book, and so stuff is going to be left out. And you mentioned Kings, exactly. It's about kings and prophets, and that's where we need to be a little bit wary, isn't it? Because if we only think in terms of kings, we're not going to fully understand what the book of Kings is actually about. Let me give one other example from the New Testament. The titles of the 4 Gospels, the Gospel according to Matthew and so forth. Now the similarity between the titles is really an indication that these titles weren't given by each of the evangelists to their books, but it was when the 4 Gospels were brought together as a collection to be read together, to be compared, contrasted. The titles are indicating that we need all 4 Gospels to provide that total picture of Jesus, who he was and what he did. So again, the titles of the 4 Gospels are pointing us in the same direction when it's coming to understanding the Gospels, making use of them in a proper way.
Yeah, so getting a little bit further into this, and you've already signaled this a little bit. What do these book titles? I think what we're prone to do is like what we do for a lot of reading. We kind of section off, oh, I've read the title, I've read this, I've read that. Therefore, let's get to the actual text. That's the stuff I actually want to read. What does the title help us do when we read about its main message?
Well, I mentioned Kings, but let me give you another example. Song of Songs, which is a Hebrew way of saying this is the greatest song of all. Is it the greatest poetry? Is it the greatest poetry, or is it the most interesting topic? We could argue over that. Song of Songs, but it's also called the Song of Solomon. That's another title. And when we give that book the title Song of Solomon, it's a book of love poetry, but that's indicating, given the Solomon connection, it's indicating it's also a wisdom book. So it's alerting the reader that these poems are not just outpourings of romantic sentiment, but they contain moral lessons. Things that we're meant to think about and implement in our lives. So it's giving a wisdom slant to the Song of Songs, and maybe giving us a bit of a hint as to why this quite unique book is in the Bible.
Yeah, and I hate doing this, but I think it's helpful not to say they're wrong titles, but maybe just what are maybe some examples or an example of an unintentionally skewed mistake, you can say, by not mistake, but like a maybe leading us not in the best direction for reading what this book is about, or help us understand this book. Does that make sense?
Honest, one title that probably leads us up the garden path is the title Ezra Nehemiah. When we call a book Ezra Nehemiah, we kind of are getting the impression that it's about Ezra and Nehemiah. And that really is unhelpful. Now, of course, they're leading figures in the book called Ezra Nehemiah. But when we read the book more carefully, we find out that the main character of the book is actually the people. Hence all the lists, all the genealogies. And the book is really talking about the achievements of the people, but also the failures of the people. And the unfortunate naming has contributed, for example, to a bit of an evangelical tradition that when we're looking at the Nehemiah part of the book, we want to turn it into some kind of guidebook for leadership. That really is not what the book, way too often, it's not what the book's about. Rather, the main message is a far more attractive one, namely, it's what the little people of the church do or fail to do. That's what's most important. So that really is quite an unfortunate book title, Ezra Nehemiah. One less unfortunate, but what about the letter to Timothy? Was that letter only written to Timothy? Was he not meant to share the contents with the church in Ephesus that he is leading? Obviously, he was meant to. So the division between Paul's books, Paul's letters to churches and Paul's letters to individuals is not... It's not
true. Yeah, Timothy and Titus,
convincing and maybe not totally helpful. Not wrong, but there's the possibility that it might just lead us in the wrong direction if we're not careful.
Yeah, that's because I remember reading that from your book, and it's something I had never thought. I mean, you read it, but I never thought about it. Where the rest of his letters are written to churches, and then this one, unfortunately, we look at this and it's written to, or what you think of is written to two individuals, when that's not really what he's doing in those two,
writing to the church through those individuals. Yeah, more accurate. Yeah,
exactly.
Kind of dipping into what I would think is part 3 of your book, the textual divisions. In general, how did the inspired authors, as far as we know, break up the text in either Old and New Testaments, and what are some features of these divisions?
Now, I hasten to add that baby crying is not here, so I think I heard a baby somewhere there, but so not guilty. And I had a bit of a discussion with the publisher about this one, and yes, I made the divisions the third part of the book because, in a sense, this might be the most surprising part of the book to readers. We can kind of get our head around titles, the order of the books. How we're dividing books was slightly a little bit more technical, but not at all complicated. But something I never was told as a theological student was that all ancient Bible manuscripts have breaks, paragraphs. Some even have chapters, like Codex Vaticanus. And of course, these don't come from the inspired authors themselves. They're due to the work of scribes, early readers. So again, we're allowed to read them, consider them, agree and possibly disagree. Let me give a couple of examples. The chapter divisions we're familiar with are medieval and Christian. They come from Stephen Langton in the 13th century. An example would be Genesis chapter 2, verse 1. Now, is this a mistake or does it represent an insight? Notice what it does. It separates the seventh day from the preceding six. So was the Archbishop Langton, did he make a blunder here? But if we think about for a moment, the seventh day is very different in character from the preceding six. God has ceased creating, and this day of rest and blessing, if it's put in chapter 2, this is suggesting that the rest of chapter 2, the beautiful description of Eden and so forth, this is filling out to some extent what rest and blessing really means. So I would suggest that Genesis 2 verse 1, the break at that point is actually an exegetical insight. In the Hebrew Bible, they have longer sections. They don't have our chapters. They have longer sections. They're called Sederim. And the first of those sections runs as far as Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. In other words, where we might have thought was a better place to put the end of a section. Just a couple of comments on Romans, the chapters in Romans. As I said, the earliest breakup of Romans into chapters is Codex Vaticanus. And the last verse of chapter 1 in that codex is chapter 1, verse 17. And that really highlights the key thematic verses about the power of the gospel in verses 16 and 17. The second chapter in Romans ends with what we call chapter 2, verse 11. And that makes that verse a punchline, for God shows no partiality. And more recent scholars have suggested, that really is a major theme in what we call Romans chapters 1 and 2. That God is concerned both with Jews and Gentiles. He shows no partiality. In other words, those breaks in the text in Codex Vaticanus are full of insight, and they reflect a careful reading of Romans, a reading that would assist modern readers as we tackle this important but also challenging book.
Yeah, so I'm going to slightly change my question just based on what I've heard, and I think you've already covered it, but how have maybe verse divisions or chapter divisions or whatnot maybe changed over the past 100 or so, or hundreds of years, and how have they affected our reading today, based or verses, I guess you can say, how we read before?
Well, the verse divisions we're familiar with, particularly in the New Testament, only go as far as the 16th century. Robert Estienne, or Stephanus, as he's called, a Protestant, in his fourth edition of the Greek New Testament, it was published in Geneva, so we're talking about 1551. This is the first time the biblical text has been divided into numbered verses. And the famous story, of course, is that he's on a journey on horseback going from Paris to Lyon, and every time the horse jolts, that explains why the verse division might be in a weird spot. No doubt he did it all at night at the inns that he was staying in on the way. So it's a lovely story, but probably not correct. But the verse divisions, they're often insightful, but of course we don't have to agree with all of them. And a couple of examples of the way the text is divided. Matthew chapter 2 verse 1. Why do we put a chapter division at this point? Well, that's where the theme of the clash of kings, Jesus versus Herod, begins. But that division also means that the first of 5 Old Testament quotations is left back in chapter 1 and is not in chapter 2. Is that a problem? But that is probably very helpful, actually, because the last part of chapter 1, where the angel appears to Joseph and speaks about the birth of Jesus, in lots of ways that is connected to the genealogy that precedes. And so, again, this chapter and verse division here is probably in a good spot. An example where things can go awry, possibly. Luke chapter 9, verse 51 is the start of a very important section in Luke's Gospel, the central travel narrative. All scholars recognise that this is a very important turning point in the Gospel of Luke, and yet Langton's divisions, and so the chapters, but also the verse divisions, they highlight the mission of the 12, chapter 9, verse 1, or the mission of the 70, 10, verse 1. In other words, they entirely miss the importance of chapter 9, verse 51. So, yeah, chapters and verses, they can be helpful, but sometimes we need to resist the prompts that they are giving us, but only after we've looked at them carefully. We've got to treat them fairly, we've got to give them considerations, but we're also allowed to disagree with them.
So my last question, and again, maybe slightly changing this question that I had sent over previously, is what maybe was the purpose of verse divisions in the first place? And then how can we read them knowing that these are not inspired divisions within the text, but are still, if you can say, like, helpful? And then how are they helpful for us today? Even I can hear and I can sense people like getting bogged down. It's like, well, if all these are like kind of wrong, just editorial stuff, like can I just do away with them? Or like, how can we as Christians maybe better faithfully read this with what we have right now?
Yeah, the verse divisions and numbering, we argue over this. What was it? Did it serve the purpose of commentary? You know, yeah, you and me can have this great argument about a particular verse. The argument is assisted by saying, yeah, but what about chapter 3, verse 6 or something like that? But they have a more positive purpose than that, certainly assisting readers to find their way around the Bible. But as I said, all ancient manuscripts have breaks and divisions. This just continues the tradition that we've always needed help in reading the biblical text. And divisions break up into chapters and then more finally into verses are really aimed at assisting Bible readers to do this. So it would be quite mistaken, I think, to get rid of these divisions. We could all decide to put the divisions in a different spot if we wanted to, but breaking up a text does assist its reading, as long as you finally give a holistic reading of a whole passage or a whole book.
Yeah, but real quick comment before Nick goes, because I think all too often which I think this book is a helpful corrective and a good word on this. It's verse divisions, all this stuff were a later invention. It's kind of totally imposed on the text, and they're just kind of making their own kind of whatever decisions. But it sounds like there's more thought that's put into it, at least editorially within the biblical text. Do I have this right?
And remember, commentaries are expensive to buy. So what we have in the Bible is a built-in commentary, don't we? Provided free of charge by earlier readers of the Bible. And like all commentaries, don't believe everything you read, but consider. We're not treating earlier Bible readers with respect, are we? Unless we at least consider how they interpreted the text, the insights they had, even if we of course have the freedom and the responsibility to make our own decisions as we interpret and read the Bible.
That's great.
Yeah, a couple helpful takeaways I was jotting down is, like you said, keeping a holistic reading of the whole book and relation to the other books. So don't forget about that, audience. Like, read the entire book within the Bible and then how it's related to the books right before and right after it, and the whole New Testament and the whole Old Testament and the whole all of Scripture, the whole canon. And then at the same time, the verse divisions sound like it's really helpful for helping citing and quickly referencing something when you're speaking or educating or, that kind of thing, when you're trying to cite a verse. So it's not, because the Bible's huge. So it'd be like finding a needle in a haystack if you're trying, if you didn't have verses.
They would go with Isaiah's scroll. Like, oh, it's somewhere way down the scroll. Just keep going. Yeah.
If you have to cite Isaiah 53 and then number 53 wasn't there, be like, well, where he says in Isaiah, and then it's just easier to say Isaiah 53.
They're more of a help than a hindrance. Yes, absolutely.
Exactly.
Totally. Yeah. And I think, Elio, it's what you're saying. What I hope people are getting from this before Nick's thing. Sorry for interrupting again, but it sounds like they're great for referencing. But if we don't notice what they're doing to the text and to our reading, then it can hinder some of our reading of the text itself.
Yeah. And then, not to get off subject, one other thing too that I'm just personally curious about and have wondered is the first two books of the New Testament, Matthew and Mark, and talking about those two of the four Gospels. And it's interesting because Matthew comes first, but Mark is actually said to be the older Gospel, and it's more direct and brief. It seems like it logically should, maybe even just for the point of it being older, be the first book in the New Testament, but it's actually Matthew.
Well, that's our modern perspective, isn't it? It's late 19th century, early 20th century, we kind of discover or work out, hey, we think Mark might be the first gospel. Now because mostly it follows Matthew in Bible orders, that's one of the reasons that Mark has been so neglected until we decided that it was possibly the first gospel written. It's really lived in the shadow of the book of Matthew. And so that's a gospel which has been amazingly neglected in church history until recently. So that's an example, like it's innocent enough, Matthew followed by Mark, but it does seem to have contributed to the neglect of Mark until recent years, which is quite sad. And it could give the impression, too, that Mark is just some kind of brief, the Reader's Digest version of the Gospel of Matthew, that Mark's been just abbreviating for some kind of reason. Yeah, and again, that's totally wrong, no doubt. And but that's the impression that can be given, and so that Mark often hasn't had the attention it deserves. Now, there's good reasons for Matthew being the first gospel, usually in lineup. Luke would be another good choice because remember, in Matthew chapter 1, technically we're still in the Old Testament period. Jesus isn't born to chapter 2. Luke likewise. Luke is in the Old Testament period. Jesus comes in Luke chapter 2. Both of them, Matthew's got a lot of Old Testament content. Luke makes a lot of the Old Testament material. So they're both in their ways ideal, like in a sense they're rivals as to what might be the best first New Testament book, to bridge Old Testament and New Testament. But, decisions which have been made, quite innocently, Mark is the second gospel, it does have an effect. And so that's a case where we are, just have to give some thought into how these books are presented and what influence it might be having on us. Now, often that influence might be subtle. We might be totally unconscious of it. Well, that's what I'm trying to highlight. We need to give more attention to these areas so that we benefit from this, the way in which the Bible material is packaged, rather than unbeknownst to us, it's kind of influencing us in the wrong kind of way.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to see if you don't read Hebrew and if you don't have the MT next to you, that the MT ends with Second Chronicles, and Chronicles starts with a long genealogy. And so what you see Matthew doing is a lot of the same stuff the Chronicles author is doing. And if you're not saying you can't speak English,
that's right.
But if you look at the English Bible, it ends with Malachi, and then it goes right into Matthew. It's like, this is kind of an
possibly that's why Matthew did what he did. Like Chronicles was a bestseller. Yeah. Chronicles was a bestseller. He's
being conscious about it.
This is a great way to start a book, with this long genealogy. It might seem strange to us, but that's right. He's reflecting the kind of thing that he's already seen in the Book of Chronicles. Yes.
Yeah, and if you guys want more of that stuff, you got to read Dr. Gospel's book. He profiles some of these things.
Those are some really important themes too, because like you're saying, with the beginning of Mark and Luke, Matthew. We're particularly talking about Matthew. The beginning is like talking a lot of the genealogies, which tie themes to the Old Testament, and really kicking off the pre-incarnation of Jesus is spoken about before Jesus is born, even within that gospel book. So it makes sense. There's connection to the Old Testament, and then on top of that, John the Baptist is an Old Testament prophet.
So I'm trying to think generally speaking, like I've heard like Malachi's before because they connect Malachi 4 with Matthew 1 and 2 and stuff.
Though in the case of Malachi, of course,
stuff.
it's only since the Protestant Reformation that Malachi has been the last book in the Old Testament. It in no ancient Greek or Latin or Hebrew lists is Malachi ever the last book in the Old Testament. It was when the Protestants decided we're not going to have the book of Maccabees in the Bible. In a sense, it was quite accidental that Malachi became the last book of the Old Testament. But despite that, it does provide a very good segue into the New Testament. For example, the Elijah who is to come, who, of course, is John the Baptist. So it certainly works as the last book in the Old Testament. It works very well, but that is a comparatively recent development when it comes to how Bibles are constructed.
Yeah. Yeah, and in John 1, the Pharisees ask John, "Are you Elijah? Are you the Christ to come?" So they're also looking at, which I'm sure kind of played into some Bible order stuff. But they look at the Gospels like, "Oh, maybe." Well,
it certainly works, but as I said, it was really historical accident. Some people have misread it. Some people suggest that like this is kind of Jewish versus Christian or something like that. Kind of we want Malachi because it's a great prophecy towards John the Baptist and Jesus. But the fact is, it was not us arguing with Jewish people, but Christians arguing among themselves. What should our canon be? And the Protestant Bible, the result of those kind of decisions, we don't believe Maccabees really belongs. That's how Malachi became the last book in the Old Testament.
Gotcha. Cool.
There's another name of a book in the Bible that the title of it causes different opinions or assumptions, and you guys might start guess it's the very end of the Bible, Revelation. And so some people might have preconceived ideas or something based on the title Revelation when it could mean something else as well. Can you describe that?
Well, again, the title Revelation comes just from the first verse or so. It's the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so forth. Really, when you read the book of Revelation, the writer John all the time talks about it as a prophecy. So, so the name is fine as like a tag to the book, but it's not giving a necessarily a great indication of what the book is about, and particularly. People think it's also called the Apocalypse, which is reflecting the Greek word behind that word revelation. And that, again, can point us in the wrong direction if we're not careful, because we start thinking, I've got to understand all this kind of weird apocalyptic literature that developed during, between the Testaments. I've got to understand all that weird kind of stuff if I'm going to understand the book of Revelation, where John calls his book a prophecy. And the main connection that John wants us to make in terms of understanding it is with Old Testament prophecy, and particularly books like Ezekiel, Daniel. We've got to cut our teeth on those kind of Old Testament prophetic books if we're going to understand the book of Revelation correctly. So Revelation could push us in the wrong direction if we don't think carefully. It's not a wrong title, but it's one that has to be handled in the right kind of way.
There we go. With some wisdom for sure that you help us with. So as we end, my last question is, these kinds of questions may distract us more than help us in our reading. Many think, how can I trust what I read in my English Bible if there's so many variations? May come up with some questions they weren't thinking before. Oh no, am I reading the right Bible? But can you encourage those listening as they read their Bibles cognizant of these features?
Well, let me assure those who are listening and watching, nothing that I've said or written is aimed at unsettling those who read the Bible with the purpose of understanding it, putting it into practice. That's what it's all about. But we'd all acknowledge that we need the assistance of other people as we read the Bible, and we need to be open to other Bible readers. And that's why we go to church and listen to sermons. That's why we might be members of a weekly Bible study group. What the paratextual features do, it sounds a bit weird, but it's true, but it's a way of having fellowship with dead people. In other words, it's connecting us to previous generations of Bible readers. They read the same Bible. They loved the same Bible that we do. And these paratextual features the names they gave books, how they ordered the books, how books are divided. They're preserving for posterity, namely us, their insights. And those insights are valuable. They're not foolproof. They have to be thought about. In other words, through the paratextual features we've been talking about, these are voices of past readers, and they potentially challenge and correct our modern day interpretive ideas. We don't have all wisdom. In other words, these features help to us with our modern prejudices and blind spots. So none of this need unsettle or disturb us. What the Paratext provides is exegetical alternatives for us to consider as we all seek to grow in our understanding of Scripture. That's the kind of positive take home that I'm suggesting.
Yeah, very nice. Thank you.
That's really helpful. So, Dr. Goswell, is there anything that we missed or we didn't kind of punctuate that you'd like to
missed
leave
everything.
our listeners with?
No, you
missed the mark.
You did very well,
Yeah.
and thanks for the opportunity, because people can wonder, what's all this about. I don't like writing books that are the same stuff that everyone else has written, so that's why this book is a little bit different.
Yeah.
But I think the readers will have a kind of a aha moment pretty often.
I think so.
And they'll be saying to themselves, why didn't I see all this before? Well, again, sometimes you don't see stuff, even if it's
100%.
right in front of you, unless someone points it out. So every Bible is a study Bible. Every Bible is providing you with helps that I'm saying will be of great assistance to you as you seek to understand and apply the Bible.
And may I add,
a commentary in your hands. Yeah, it's not just it's a Bible. Yeah, it's God's inspired word, but they're actually providing you a commentary on how to read it if you know what you're looking for, which I think this book is going to help people with. Yeah.
May I add, too, something that's helpful in your book? You have the study questions for further exploration.
Oh, that's right. Yep.
In the back of the book, so if you have a hard time even asking the questions, so sometimes half the battle is just knowing the right questions to ask, and you go chapter by chapter, helping gear our minds, asking the right questions. With very first question, chapter 1, question 1, how credible is the division of the Pentateuch, Torah, into 5 books? Starts setting our mind, and then you go into chapter 1, you answer all these questions. So,
thank you for that.
Helpful study right there.
That's awesome. Yeah. So this is a fun conversation, and I really do think there'll be a ton of aha moments. The stuff that we read the text, which is great. We're readers. Christians are readers, and we should be readers of the text. But we forget there's so much else telling us this is how you read it. And I think we miss those, and I think your book's going to help us find out what those things are. So thanks for coming on, Dr.
Peter,
Gospel.
Nick,
it's been a pleasure having you.
Too. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Of course.
Boris.